In 1973, was 29 years old, a high-level narcotics trafficker, preparing to face federal charges at a courthouse in Brooklyn. The city was known for organized crime, a place where influence moved quietly through networks of money and loyalty. It was an environment where illegal markets operated alongside everyday life, and where power often existed outside formal authority. At the time, Matthews was one of the most prominent figures in this underground system, and the environment rewarded discretion and control while punishing exposure and mistakes. Federal agencies had begun focusing on major trafficking operations. Investigations were expanding, and individuals connected to large-scale distribution networks were being identified and charged. Matthews had become a central target. He was scheduled to appear in court on July 2, 1973, facing charges that could result in a long prison sentence. The system was structured to contain and prosecute. Those identified were expected to appear, to be processed, and to be judged within the framework of federal law. Matthews was expected to follow that process. He did not. On the morning of his court appearance, Matthews failed to arrive. Instead, he withdrew large amounts of money, collected his girlfriend, Cheryl Denise Brown, and left. He abandoned properties, assets, and an established network. From that point forward, his location became unknown. The absence created immediate consequences. Federal authorities lost direct access to the central figure in their case. Investigations shifted from prosecution to pursuit. The case transformed from a courtroom matter into a fugitive investigation. Despite extensive efforts, Matthews was not located. There were no confirmed sightings, no physical evidence of his whereabouts, and no recovery of his body. Over time, the case remained open but unresolved. In December 2025, federal authorities officially ended their search. The file was closed without a definitive conclusion. By the early 1970s, Frank Matthews had established himself as a major figure in narcotics distribution across the United States. He had moved beyond local operations and built a network that extended across 21 states. His system included supply connections, processing locations, and distribution channels designed to operate without direct exposure. 2 drug mills in Brooklyn were reported to be fortified and protected, indicating a level of organization and planning beyond small-scale activity. A former street-level participant who had advanced through experience, Matthews developed a reputation for independence. He avoided reliance on established crime families and instead formed direct connections with international suppliers. This approach allowed him to operate outside traditional structures that had previously controlled the drug trade. Among other traffickers, he represented a shift in power. In a system long influenced by the Italian mafia, Matthews demonstrated that independent operations could reach comparable scale. This placed him in a unique position, both influential and isolated. His demeanor was described as controlled and deliberate. He maintained a level of distance that limited what others knew about his plans. This approach contributed to his ability to manage a large network while reducing risk. Within his organization, Matthews maintained structure. Operations were compartmentalized, meaning individuals involved in different parts of the system had limited knowledge of the whole. This reduced the likelihood that law enforcement could trace activities back to him through a single point of failure. Financially, he accumulated significant wealth. Reports described large quantities of cash stored in private locations, along with properties that reflected his status. One residence in Staten Island was located in an exclusive neighborhood, placing him in close proximity to established crime figures. Despite the scale of his activities, Matthews maintained a family life. He lived with Barbara Hinton, his common-law wife, and their 3 sons. The household reflected the financial success of his operations, providing stability and access to resources not available to most families. He also arranged for private education for his children. A tutor was hired to teach them at home, indicating a level of involvement in their upbringing. Accounts suggest that he participated in family routines and maintained a presence in their daily lives. This combination of roles, large-scale trafficker and active family member, defined his position. He operated within a high-risk environment while maintaining a structured personal life. However, as federal attention increased, the conditions that supported this balance began to change. Investigations expanded, and individuals connected to his network were identified and charged. The pressure moved closer to him directly. When Matthews failed to appear in court and disappeared, the structure he had built was left without its central figure. Operations were disrupted, assets were seized, and associates were investigated. Attention shifted to those closest to him. Barbara Hinton became a focus of federal inquiry. Authorities sought information about Matthews' location, his plans, and his network. She was offered immunity in exchange for cooperation but declined. She was later brought before a federal grand jury and questioned under the possibility of conspiracy charges. Despite legal pressure, she maintained that she had no knowledge of Matthews' whereabouts. Her refusal to cooperate remained consistent over time. She did not provide information to investigators, and she did not alter her statements. As legal proceedings continued, she was indicted alongside other individuals connected to Matthews' network. Her defense argued that the charges were intended to pressure her into cooperation. The case moved through the legal system, but her position did not change. Meanwhile, her 3 sons grew up without confirmed information about their father. At the time of his disappearance, they were young. Their understanding of events developed over time, shaped by partial information and public attention surrounding the case. The absence of a clear outcome created uncertainty. Matthews was neither confirmed dead nor located alive. This lack of resolution extended beyond the investigation and into the lives of those connected to him. Over the years, unverified reports suggested possible sightings or continued activity, but none were confirmed by authorities. The case remained open, supported by intermittent leads that did not produce conclusive results. When the search officially ended in 2025, the status of Frank Matthews remained unchanged. He had entered the system as a defendant expected to face trial and exited it as a fugitive without a recorded end. His position in history is defined by that absence. But not everyone respected. One force in particular, the United States federal authorities, embodied the greatest danger to his position. Agencies such as the were focused on dismantling large-scale narcotics operations. These institutions were structured, methodical, and persistent. They were known for long investigations, surveillance, and the use of legal pressure to break networks apart. Their goal was not only to arrest individuals but to dismantle entire systems of distribution. They believed in control through prosecution. Their approach was based on gathering evidence, building cases, and applying legal force until cooperation was achieved. They had learned how to operate over time without immediate visible results, allowing investigations to grow quietly before acting. To them, Matthews was not just another target. He represented a large and independent operation that had avoided traditional structures. His ability to bypass established crime families and maintain a network across multiple states made him a priority. At the same time, Matthews also faced tension from within the criminal world. His independence placed him outside the protection of established groups, including figures connected to the one known conflict involved an associate linked to a disputed heroin transaction. When a conflict arose, Matthews responded by taking direct action, which was considered a serious breach of accepted boundaries within organized crime. This created a second layer of risk. While federal authorities pursued him through legal means, criminal organizations could respond through retaliation. In this environment, Matthews stood between 2 opposing forces: law enforcement seeking to capture him and criminal networks that could view him as a threat. The federal authorities continued their pursuit by relying on structured legal processes. However, Matthews had built his operation by exploiting weaknesses within that system. He used compartmentalization, ensuring that individuals within his network had limited knowledge of the full operation. This made it difficult for investigators to connect evidence directly to him. Even when associates were identified, the information they provided was often incomplete. Authority tolerated certain delays because investigations of this scale required time. Agencies focused on building strong cases rather than acting quickly. This approach allowed Matthews to continue operating for years without direct interruption. At the same time, the criminal environment he operated in also contained its own weaknesses. There was no single authority controlling all activity, and independent operators could expand if they avoided direct conflict. Matthews used this gap to build connections outside traditional systems. Over time, this combination of factors allowed him to grow his network without immediate consequence. His operations expanded across multiple states, and his financial resources increased. As enforcement efforts intensified, Matthews adjusted his methods. He relied on indirect communication, trusted intermediaries, and controlled movement of goods and money. These measures reduced visibility and delayed detection. This pattern continued until the moment he was formally charged. By then, he had already developed systems designed to protect him from direct exposure. When he failed to appear in court and disappeared, those same systems contributed to the difficulty in locating him. There were no clear records of his movements, no direct links to follow, and no immediate evidence pointing to his destination. The system that had been designed to prosecute him was left without its central figure. Over time, the absence of resolution became its own outcome. Matthews was neither captured nor confirmed dead. The investigation continued, but without a clear direction. The structure that once allowed authorities to build a case now struggled to close it. The first incident did not come with noise or violence. It came quietly, during what should have been a routine moment. Was preparing to face federal charges. His court appearance had been scheduled. In the eyes of the system, the process was already in motion. But before that moment could happen, the pressure arrived in another form. Federal authorities began moving around him, not directly, but through what he had built. Agents from the turned their attention to his property, his finances, and the people closest to him. The Staten Island mansion, once a symbol of stability and success, was no longer secure. The move to seize assets connected to him. The home was taken. The structure he had built for his family was removed, not through force, but through law. There was no confrontation between Matthews and the agents. No exchange of words. No resistance in the moment. But the message was clear. The system had entered his personal space. It had reached beyond his operations and into his home. At the same time, agents approached Barbara Hinton, the woman who lived with him and raised his children. They asked questions. They requested cooperation. They offered protection in exchange for information. This, too, was a form of pressure. It showed that the authorities were willing to move around Matthews, to apply force through those connected to him, rather than waiting for direct access. Matthews became aware of these developments. He understood what it meant. Still, he chose not to respond in a visible way. He did not confront the authorities. He did not attempt to negotiate. He did not publicly resist. Instead, he continued his movements quietly. He withdrew money. He prepared without drawing attention. To those watching from the outside, this appeared as weakness. In the criminal world, a man in his position was expected to act decisively. When pressure reached the level of family and property, it was often seen as a line that demanded response. But Matthews remained silent. There was no visible reaction to the seizure of his home. No public defense of his name. No attempt to challenge the system directly. Observers began to question what they were seeing. Some believed the pressure had already broken him. Others thought he had lost control of the situation. They saw a man being surrounded, and a man who was not pushing back. They did not yet understand what that silence meant. Those closest to expected something different. They had seen how he operated. They had watched him build a network that stretched across states. They had seen him handle conflicts, manage risk, and maintain control in situations where others failed. To them, this moment did not match the man they knew. They expected movement. Some believed he would disappear immediately, leaving before the system could close in further. Others thought he would reinforce his position, securing what remained of his operation and protecting those around him. A few expected confrontation, not necessarily through violence, but through action that showed he was still in control. But none of that happened in a visible way. Instead, Matthews remained calm. His movements were quiet. His decisions were not shared. There were no signals to the outside world that he was preparing for anything. This created confusion. Those who did not understand his methods saw hesitation. They saw a man allowing pressure to build without response. But those who understood the environment recognized something else. They understood that in a system built on surveillance and reaction, movement could create exposure. Every action could be tracked. Every sudden change could draw attention. Every visible response could give authorities what they needed. Patience, in that context, was not passive. It was controlled. Matthews had spent years building systems that relied on distance and separation. He understood how information moved. He understood how quickly mistakes could be used against him. By not reacting openly, he limited what could be observed. He allowed the system to continue its process without interference, while he prepared in ways that were not visible. Those who knew him best began to see this not as weakness, but as timing. They recognized that he was waiting for the moment when action would not be seen until it was already complete. Still, not everyone shared that understanding. In both the criminal world and among those watching from the outside, the silence continued to be misread. It was seen as hesitation, as pressure taking effect, as a man running out of options. That perception would remain in place until the moment he acted. And when that moment came, it would not unfold slowly. It would happen all at once. The next incident occurred weeks later, at a federal level, as the case against continued to build. This time, the provocation was worse. Federal prosecutors expanded their reach and began targeting the people around him. Associates were arrested. Members of his network were indicted. The system was no longer observing, it was acting. Again, Matthews remained restrained. He did not appear. He did not respond publicly. He did not attempt to challenge the charges in court. Each move by authorities increased their confidence. They believed the pressure was working. They believed the network was weakening. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous. The next incident occurred shortly after, inside his personal life. Agents approached Barbara Hinton directly. They questioned her, offered her immunity, and demanded information about Matthews' location. This time, the provocation reached his family. Again, Matthews remained restrained. There was no visible response from him. No message. No interference. Barbara refused to cooperate. To authorities, this reinforced their belief that pressure would eventually break those connected to him. Their confidence grew stronger. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous. The next incident occurred during legal proceedings, when Barbara Hinton was brought before a federal grand jury. This time, the provocation became formal and direct. She was threatened with the same conspiracy charges her husband faced. The message was clear: cooperate or face consequences. Again, Matthews remained restrained. He did not surface. He did not intervene. From the outside, it appeared as if he had abandoned the situation. Authorities continued forward, believing they were closing in. Their confidence increased. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous. The next incident occurred in 1975, during the trial of Matthews' associates. This time, the provocation expanded into full prosecution. 18 individuals connected to his network were charged. Barbara Hinton was among them. The system had moved completely into action. Again, Matthews remained restrained. There was still no appearance. No communication that authorities could confirm. To prosecutors, this reinforced a belief that the case would eventually resolve through pressure and legal force. Their confidence continued to grow. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous. The next incident occurred over time, as reports and leads began to surface. Authorities followed tips, searched locations, and pursued possible sightings. One report led agents to a bank in North Carolina, where they were told they had just missed him. This time, the provocation became pursuit without results. Again, Matthews remained restrained. No confirmed trace was found. No direct evidence linked him to any location. Despite the lack of results, authorities continued their efforts, believing that persistence would eventually succeed. Their confidence remained. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous. Everything changed when his absence became permanent, and his family was left to carry the consequences. This incident crossed a line. The system had already taken his assets. It had already pursued his associates. But now, the impact settled fully on those he left behind. Barbara Hinton was left to raise 3 children alone, while facing federal charges. The boys grew up without their father, without answers, and without certainty about whether he was alive or dead. Authority response remained focused on the case, not the outcome for the family. There was no resolution offered to them. No closure. Only continued pressure and unanswered questions. From that moment, the outcome became inevitable. The case would no longer be defined by capture or conviction. It would be defined by absence. That evening, spoke quietly. There was no gathering, no public announcement, no display of authority. The moment was small, contained within the walls of his private space. Only a few people were present, and even among them, not everyone understood what they were hearing. He did not threaten. There were no raised voices, no signs of anger. He did not speak about retaliation or resistance. Instead, he spoke with calm certainty, the kind that does not require explanation. He stated what would happen next. His words were simple. He would not go to court. He would not submit to the process that had already been prepared for him. The system expected him to appear, to stand before a judge, and to accept whatever outcome followed. He made it clear, without saying much, that this would not happen. There was no detailed plan shared in that moment. No timeline, no destination, no instructions that could be repeated. What he communicated was not a plan, but a decision. Those who heard him understood the meaning. They understood that this was not hesitation. It was not confusion or delay. It was a final choice, made after the pressure had already closed in. Some may have expected negotiation. Others may have believed he would find a way to manage the situation within the system. But the tone of his voice removed that possibility. It was controlled, measured, and final. For those who knew him, this kind of quiet carried weight. He was not a man who spoke without purpose. When he did speak, it was because the decision had already been made. There was no argument. No attempt to change his mind. The moment passed without drama, but it left something behind. An understanding that what was coming would not be reversed. The setting of the final incident was ordinary. It was a summer morning in July 2, 1973. The day had already been marked by expectation. It was the day Frank Matthews was scheduled to appear in federal court. The courthouse prepared as it always did. Officials followed routine procedures. Cases were listed. Schedules were set. There was nothing unusual about the environment itself. Routine continued as usual. Inside the system, his name was simply one among many. Another defendant expected to arrive, to be processed, and to move through the legal system like all the others before him. Outside, the city moved forward without pause. Traffic continued. People went to work. The day did not signal anything out of the ordinary. But within that routine, something had already changed. Matthews was not on his way to court. Instead, he moved quietly through a different set of actions. He accessed his safety deposit boxes. He removed large amounts of money. He collected Cheryl Denise Brown. There were no public signs of urgency. No visible disruption that would draw attention. To anyone watching from a distance, it would have appeared like a normal day. This contrast made what followed unforgettable. At the courthouse, time passed. His absence became noticeable. Then it became confirmed. He was not coming. In that moment, the routine broke. What had been expected to follow a known path no longer had direction. The system, prepared for process, was now faced with absence. And that absence would not be corrected. The United States federal authorities escalated publicly. By the time of the scheduled court appearance, the process was no longer quiet or contained. The charges against were formal, documented, and ready to proceed. This time, there was no ambiguity. He had been ordered to appear before a federal court. The expectation was clear. His presence was required. The system had completed its preparation, and the next step was enforcement through law. When he did not appear, the response was immediate. A warrant was issued. His name was no longer just part of an investigation. It became part of a national search. And moved into coordinated action. His disappearance was now public. His properties were raided. His name circulated through law enforcement channels across the country. A reward was placed for information leading to his capture. The system had shifted from prosecution to pursuit. This was the clearest form of pressure the authorities could apply. It was no longer contained within courtrooms or investigations. It was visible, active, and widespread. And still, there was no response from Matthews. No statement. No appearance. No contact that could be confirmed. But in his absence, a decision had already been made. He stood, not in a courtroom, but in his choice. He stood outside the system that had been prepared to contain him. And he did not return. According to the sequence of events, everything happened in a short span of time. There was no prolonged struggle. No extended confrontation between Matthews and authorities. His actions were precise. Before the court date, he accessed his financial reserves. Safety deposit boxes were emptied. Large amounts of cash were removed. These were not random movements, they were controlled and intentional. He then gathered Cheryl Denise Brown. There was no delay between preparation and execution. The steps followed each other in order, without interruption. Before intervention was possible, the outcome was decided. By the time authorities acted, raiding his residence, searching his properties, questioning those connected to him, Matthews was already gone. There was no trace left behind that could immediately guide the search. No confirmed direction. No clear evidence of where he had gone. The system, built to respond, arrived after the action had already been completed. What followed was not a confrontation, but an absence. No fingerprints. No confirmed sightings. No recovery. The decisive action was not visible in a single moment of force, but in the speed and completeness of his disappearance. It was controlled, deliberate, and final. And it left nothing behind that could be undone. Stopped immediately. Not in the presence of authorities, and not in the way the system expected, but in his movement within it. His operations, once active across many states, no longer had his direct control. His visible life, the one connected to property, business, and public identity, came to an end. He did not resist authority in a traditional sense. There was no arrest, no confrontation, no final exchange between him and the agents who had spent years building a case against him. He did not fight, because he was not there to be taken. Instead, his response to authority was absence. By failing to appear in court, he removed himself from the system entirely. He did not engage with it. He did not challenge it. He did not acknowledge it. Before being removed from that system, he had already made his position clear. His final line was not spoken in a courtroom or recorded in any official transcript. It existed in his actions. He would not be processed. He would not stand trial. He would not allow the outcome to be decided by the system that had closed in around him. Those who understood the situation recognized this for what it was. It was not surrender in the traditional sense. It was a controlled exit. A decision carried out without delay, without announcement, and without reversal. From that point forward, there was no further communication from him that authorities could confirm. His role in the case ended not with a conclusion, but with disappearance. The United States federal authorities continued their work, but the outcome had changed. The maintained the search for decades. They survived the case, but with lasting consequence. They had built a prosecution designed to bring down a major figure in narcotics distribution. Instead, they were left with an unresolved absence. The case remained open for years, supported by leads that did not produce results. Reports were followed. Locations were checked. Individuals were questioned. But no final outcome was reached. Over time, the investigation became one of the longest-running fugitive cases in federal history. Within the broader environment, behavior began to shift. The disappearance demonstrated something that had rarely been seen at that level. A figure of that scale had avoided both arrest and confirmed death. For those operating within similar systems, it became an example. Not of open defiance, but of what could happen when preparation, timing, and opportunity aligned. For law enforcement, it reinforced the need for earlier intervention, stronger coordination, and tighter control over high-level targets. The absence of closure created a different kind of impact. There was no trial to study, no confession to analyze, no final record to complete the case. Instead, there was only the fact of disappearance. Within his family, the consequences were more personal. Barbara Hinton raised their children without confirmed answers. The sons grew into adulthood without knowing whether their father was alive or dead. There was no resolution for them, only uncertainty that continued over time. In December 2025, federal authorities officially ended the search. The case was closed without a definitive conclusion. The message required no repetition. A man had entered the system as a defendant and left it as a question. And that question remained unanswered. When events were reviewed, a pattern emerged. Investigators, journalists, and those who had followed the case over the years began to look back at the sequence with distance. What once appeared as separate moments, court dates, property seizures, interviews, and silence, started to form a clear structure. The first stage was escalation. Had grown his operations over time, expanding across multiple states and building independent supply lines. This growth drew attention. Federal agencies increased surveillance, gathered intelligence, and prepared legal action. As his influence expanded, so did the pressure against him. The second stage was warnings. These warnings did not come as direct statements. They appeared through actions. The seizure of his property, the questioning of those close to him, and the formal charges placed against him all signaled that the system was closing in. Each step was a message. Appear in court. Cooperate. Submit to the process. But those messages were not answered. Instead, Matthews remained silent. He did not respond publicly. He did not adjust in ways that could be observed. His lack of visible reaction created uncertainty about what he would do next. The third stage was system failure. The legal process had been designed to bring him into custody. The court date was set. The charges were prepared. The authorities were ready. But the system depended on one condition, that he would appear. When he did not, the process broke. The investigation shifted from control to pursuit. And the continued their efforts, but they were now reacting to an absence rather than managing a case. Leads were followed, but none produced confirmation. Reports suggested possible sightings, but none were verified. Over time, the trail grew colder. The same systems that had been effective in building a case struggled to resolve it without a central figure. The conclusion was unavoidable. Matthews had identified the moment when pressure reached its highest point and acted before the system could complete its process. Whether he remained alive or not could not be confirmed. But the effect of his decision was clear. He had removed himself from the structure designed to contain him. For decades, the case remained open, but unchanged. In 2025, when authorities officially ended the search, the final review did not produce a new answer. It only confirmed what had already been understood through the pattern. Escalation had led to pressure. Pressure had led to decision. And that decision had led to disappearance. Long after the incident, the story continued to circulate. It moved through conversations, through law enforcement records, through interviews and quiet recollections. It was repeated in fragments, sometimes as fact, sometimes as speculation, but always with the same unanswered question at its center. The name did not fade with time. It remained, not because of noise or spectacle, but because there was no ending attached to it. There was no final arrest. No confirmed death. No moment that allowed the story to close. For those in law enforcement, it became a case that resisted completion. A file that stayed open longer than expected, and then closed without resolution. For those who had known him, it became something else. A memory without confirmation. A presence defined by absence. The details of his life, his rise, his wealth, his influence, remained part of the record. But they were no longer the center of the story. What remained was the question of what happened after July 2, 1973. Over time, theories continued to exist. Some believed he had been killed. Others believed he had escaped and lived quietly elsewhere. Neither was proven. His family carried that uncertainty the longest. Barbara Hinton never provided answers. His sons grew older without clarity. The absence became part of their lives, something that did not change with time. Even as decades passed, the story did not settle. It remained incomplete. And that incompleteness gave it weight. In places like this, where systems are built on control and outcomes are expected to follow process, one absence can remain longer than any conclusion. It becomes a reminder that not every case reaches an end. Some disappearances are never solved, they are simply lived with.